Hello, everybody. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our 2021 V1 release webinar. My name is Greg Lutz. I'm the product manager, and I'll be leading this webinar today. With me, I have a few of our technical engagement engineers, Alec and Hunter, and they will help field your questions during the webinar. Today, I'm going to discuss all of the new and exciting things that we've added in the 2021 V1 release of ComponentOne. So what I'll do is I'll go through each of the major product lines that had new features. But keep in mind that in addition to all of these, we also provide bug fixes and minor enhancements to all of our products, in which you can check out in the change logs or the release history in the documentation. So if you don't see something here today, you can also check out our release history in the documentation. I'll start with Blazor, and then I'll run through WinForms, WPF, ASP.NET, and our service components. And then I'll show how you can quickly update to the latest version of any product, and then finish with a quick recap of our 2021 roadmap so you can see what's coming next. If you have any questions at any point, you can enter them into the questions panel of GoToWebinar, and Alec and Hunter will try their best to answer them on the spot, but we'll also answer them at the end of the presentation. Our newest Blazor edition continues to expand with new input and layout controls built natively in Blazor for both server and WebAssembly applications. This includes a new window, tooltip, date range picker, and mask text box control. All of these controls are natively written in Blazor. For existing controls, we've also added some useful new features. First, let's look at the new Blazor window components. Create modal and modeless prompts and dialogues in Blazor using the new C1 window component. C1 window can be used like a full pop-up window with support for resizing, closing, full screen, and dragging the window using the mouse. In addition to fully customizing the window header, footer, and content area, you can also quickly instantiate a C1 window using static methods for displaying quick confirmation and prompt dialogues. So you could use a confirmation dialog to quickly get user confirmation or cancellation. You can use a prompt dialog to just quickly alert them about something in your UI. You can also get the user's result and customize the OK and cancel button text. You can also use C1 window as a simple pop-up to just display some additional information from any owner element. So you can customize the position of the floating pop-up in relation to its owner and configure how the pop-up closes, whether it be by click, hover, or losing focus. One of the scenarios for using C1 window is to provide pop-up editing for FlexGrid. So if traditional inline editing is not as ideal in your web app, you can combine both controls, FlexGrid and C1 window, to provide a full input form for editing a FlexGrid row. So we include a sample with the Blazor edition install, which you can check out. Next, we have the new Blazor mask text box. This is pretty standard, but oftentimes absolutely necessary. And who wants to program one of these on their own? With a mask editor, you can prevent users from entering invalid inputs. And of course, it skips over literals when saving the data back to the data source. Last year, we released a standard date time picker component. So this release, we've included a specialized date range picker for selecting a date range. So this is really helpful when you're trying to book a service for a range of time or analyzing data for a specific date window. You may limit the date range to a single month or use a multi-month calendar in the dropdown to select ranges, and you can also use the mouse or keyboard. A handy new component we've finally provided you with is a tooltip. Yes, believe it or not, there are no tooltips natively in Blazor. So with the tooltip, you can show them when the user hovers over any element. You can specify the position and where the tooltip appears. Our Blazor FlexGrid gets some enhancements this release, including column resizing. This is supported in both Blazor Server and WebAssembly. Our Blazor FlexChart now supports line markers that allow you to add a mouse-driven cursor to your charts. The cursor consists of a text element used to display information about the point under the mouse and optional lines to indicate the exact position. Our Blazor calendar component now supports customization of the day slots. So you can use HTML to create a template for each type of day slot. You can use this feature to add interaction to your calendar or visualize data, such as events and appointments. And lastly, for Blazor, our list view now supports multiple item selection using the mouse and keyboard. With checkboxes. Just simply set the Show Checkboxes property to display the checkboxes. Previously, we did support multiple adjacent item selection. All right, next, let's take a look at what's new in WinForms for 2021 V1. The main focus for us has been continuing to port our .NET Framework controls to .NET 5 with new controls, same API. We've also been able to add some much needed enhancements to FlexGrid and some others. And if you're wondering about .NET 6, all of our .NET 5 controls should work in the .NET 6 preview, as Microsoft has made the .NET 6 a seamless upgrade from .NET 5. So as we continue to migrate more controls to .NET 5 this release, the following controls are now available: C1 Flex Pivot, C1 Maps, C1 Tree View, C1 Flex Report, C1 Flex Viewer, C1 Document, and a bunch of components in C1 Input and C1 Command, as well as several themes, including Expression Dark, Expression Light, Mac Blue, Mac Silver, and High Contrast. We're now over 50% migrated to .NET 5 after 2 releases, and we plan to be mostly complete by the end of 2021. And you can check out the full roadmap blog, which details specifically which controls are coming in the upcoming releases, in our blog at that link. In this release, we're also able to add some helpful new features for FlexGrid, such as multi-column sorting through the API or at runtime by holding the control key. And grouping by context menu is added this release. So no longer do you need that old-fashioned grouping panel to enable runtime grouping. Both of these new features are available in .NET Framework and .NET 5. Some other enhancements include ComponentOne maps can now be programmatically zoomed to center on certain items using the new Zoom to Items method, and you can customize your text markers with additional rotation angle properties. With ComponentOne Flex Report, users may now create business reports from cloud data sources such as Salesforce, Dynamics, QuickBooks, Google Analytics, and OData, all of this using the Flex Report Designer. This integration enables users to create reports in the same way against traditional data sources by choosing fields or writing SQL queries. This connection is supported using the ComponentOne data connectors, which is a standalone library and part of our service components package. But if you're using the runtime Flex Report Designer, it's all included in there. And lastly, if you're in Germany or if you distribute your apps there, you will now enjoy newly updated localization files for all built-in strings for ComponentOne controls, professionally translated by native German speakers. Next, let's move on to WPF. Like WinForms, we focused a lot on migrating more controls to .NET 5. And we plan to fully support .NET 6 later in the year across all of the ComponentOne controls that are supporting .NET 5. We're also about 50% of the way there to completing our WPF migration. This release adds C1 Calendar, C1 Progress Bar, C1 Accordion, Drag Drop Manager, Spell Checker, and C1 Radial Menu. Again, like WinForms, we've published the full roadmap on the blog, which you can check out. With our .NET 5 WPF controls, you'll notice a new style for some of them. We call it a fluent or more modern style. This includes the new C1 Calendar for WPF. And this calendar supports custom UI templates, smooth animation, full touch support. Our WPF accordion control also has a new fluent style for .NET 5. It's more than a traditional accordion because you can configure all the panels to be expanded at one time. FlexGrid for WPF includes some enhancements this release for both .NET Framework and .NET 5. This includes multiple column sorting by the mouse and keyboard, just like in WinForms. There's also a new filter row feature, which is a classic take on filtering using the top row. And the filter row also includes autocomplete and suggestion to help find filter values. FlexGrid for WPF also introduces our new hover styles feature. This is a feature most often seen in web apps where the cell shows a different style for hovering, which is separate from the selection. So you can set the hover style to apply to a single cell or an entire row or an entire column. Last year, we refactored OLAP for WPF for .NET 5, which is now known as Flex Pivot. And for this release, we've added OLAP Cube support for .NET 5, so you can display data from OLAP data sources with support for KPIs or key point indicators, like your goal, status, and trend. All right, next let's take a look at what's new in ASP.NET MVC. In this release, we're adding a new date range picker component and calculated fields for our collection view component. The new input date range control is an advanced date picker that allows users to select a range of dates, just like we saw in the similar Blazor control. So selecting a date range is helpful for booking service accommodations or analyzing data for a specific window. And you can limit the date range that the user may pick from and use a multi-month calendar in the dropdown to select date ranges. With the collection view, you can now add calculated fields. Each calculated field contains a name and an expression, and the regular expression may contain the variable $sign to refer to the current data item, so you can create your own custom columns to display custom calculations in your dataset. Lastly, in the What's New section here, let me highlight what's new in our service components. So these are our newest components that are built on .NET Standard and .NET Core. So they work in all .NET 5 applications, including .NET 5, even WinUI. These data service components provide data analysis engines for aggregating and slicing data connectors for connecting to and integrating data from various online sources like Dynamics, Google Analytics, Salesforce, QuickBooks, and others. Plus, in here is where we provide a lot of useful cross-platform components like a data collection view, a calculation engine, and a text parser. Essentially, a lot of these components that we're really using across all of our other components, we make them available for you to use at the core level with our service components. But what's new in this release is we've added support for provider factories and support for the Entity Framework Core 3.1, and we've added data connector integration across some of our other ComponentOne products. So let me share a bit more detail here. So regarding the data connectors enhancements, the DB Provider Factory is a provider pattern that helps developers write generic data access code to access different types of data sources. If you implement DB Provider Factories, you're able to more easily separate out the data connection properties like the connection strings and your shared configuration files, and use this approach to access multiple data sources. We have a lot more details in a blog, which you can check out on our website. We also updated the data connectors to support Entity Framework Core 3.1, which includes, among other feature gains, reverse engineering of data source views. And in this release, we're also rolling out some more data connector integration. So now that we have these data connectors that can connect to all of these various online data sources, let's give that power to our end users, people who are using some of our applications, such as our Report Designer and Data Engine Workbench app. So this means that you'll be able to connect to data sources like those ones I mentioned, Salesforce, Dynamics, etc., through the UI. And internally, these tools are using, of course, our data connectors library, which means that you too could program against these components and create similar solutions in your applications. I mentioned the Flex Report Designer earlier, but if you don't know about the Workbench app, it's a desktop app for Windows and Mac designed to create and visualize queries without using code. It uses our data engine library and it helps to visualize the functionality of this data engine. So further, the script and the JSON that's generated by this Workbench app can then be used in your applications. And the Workbench app can now export queries to CSV in this release. So all of these updates are great and all, but what's the best way to get the updates? You have two options. One of them is to use our web installer, the C1 control panel, that lets you download and install any version of ComponentOne controls. Or if you're using our public NuGet packages, then you probably already have the update since we released it last week. But we also install local copies of the NuGet packages if you want to create a local repository. It's helpful for larger teams so you can control which versions of the libraries are being used. But let me talk a bit more about the standard way to update, and that is using the C1 control panel. So this allows you to download and install all the updates through this web installer. If you click download from the website, this is the application that will be downloaded to your machine and that you will run. But if you saved it onto your computer, you can just launch it and update it without having to log in, go through the website. The full install from the Install tab will give you all the latest samples and control libraries. You can choose the latest version from the dropdown within the platform box. Check the platform tile, the checkbox, and then click Proceed at the bottom to perform the installation updates. But let me also share something else that you might not know exists. If you just want to get a zip file of the control libraries, you can get it from the Build Repository tab. Find the product and then click Download or Update. And from the little pop-up, you can quickly find the release notes and download a zip without having to fully install the product. So the benefit of the full install is that all of the files will be put in the right place, and you can also get the samples. Some of our newest products like .NET 5 and Blazor are not available through the Build repository yet. So you still need to do the full install to get those. But from the C1 control panel, you can also activate a license or launch our Samples Explorer application. There's a lot more I could cover, but we'll save that for another video. So what's to come in 2021? It's still going to be a big year for .NET and ComponentOne as we still have many more improvements planned. There will be 2 more major releases this year, about 4 months and 8 months out. As always, our focus is to deliver useful and customer requested features for our top controls while also supporting the new .NET platforms. Our goal is to complete most of the .NET 5 migration by the end of the year, as well as simultaneously supporting .NET 6 within this .NET 5 version of the controls. The migration from .NET 5 to 6 will be seamless. It's not going to be the same larger effort that's been taken with .NET Framework to 5. Later this year, we will also be introducing a WinUI 3 version of all of our popular controls. The WinUI 3 control rollout will mimic Blazor. So like a fortune teller, I can tell you that we will have flex grid and input controls, flex chart, and others like list view and calendars. If you look at the Blazor controls, those are the controls that we will have in WinUI and rolled out roughly in the same order. And then after WinUI 3, we will also add MAUI to the mix. So if you haven't heard of MAUI, it's essentially the successor to Xamarin. So for creating cross-platform frameworks that not only support Android and iOS, but will support WinUI and Blazor eventually. Ultimately, our WinUI, Blazor, and MAUI control sets will be identical. Also this year, we plan to improve our service components to include more data service integration. For instance, you'll be able to more easily connect to online data sources that I mentioned through Visual Studio. We also plan to make this set of data service components more accessible to our existing WinForms users. Currently, they're exclusive to Studio Enterprise. And lastly, but as always, we're committed to supporting the existing platforms with new controls and enhancements, a lot of which you saw me show today. We look at user feedback and requests to fuel this roadmap. Some specific features can be found on the roadmap blog. I'm not going to mention them all right now. Blazor will continue to see a lot of growth since it's new and on part of our long-term MAUI and WinUI roadmap. So that wraps up this brief webinar today. So I'll stop now to answer any questions that we may have. And if not, then we will see you all at the next release. So Alec, how are we looking at questions?
Hey, Greg. So we just have one question in right this moment, which is there any ETA for print preview and print document compatibility with .NET 5?
Yes, actually, yes. So our print document and print preview, those components, they were previously associated with C1 report. And then when C1 report was replaced with Flex report, they seem to have disappeared from the radar, but we do have plans to release them actually with the V2 release, which will be in 4 months. Still be available for .NET 5 very shortly.
All right, we just got another question,
Sure.
Which is, does C1 Live no longer exist?
C1 Live does exist, but it's no longer being maintained. So it's really, if you love it and you want to continue using it, go for it. But we recommend using the build repository tab of the C1 control panel to get the zips. The C1 Live was essentially just a quick way to get the updates without having to do the full install. We're replacing that with the build repository tab of the control panel. And actually, it used to be that tab used to be called C1 Live until we renamed it build repository just to sort of generalize it. So that tab is actually very similar in functionality.
All right, for the moment, oh, never mind, here's one more.
Sure.
Hi, is the WinForms calendar control available for .NET 5 already or with this upcoming release?
let me quickly check the list. Give me 1 second here. I didn't want to give you any wrong information because it was C1 Calendar. It's a great question because C1 Calendar was on the original .NET 5 roadmap, but it was not in the release. Therefore, it's most likely going to be part of V2. It probably just barely did make it for V1. It'll be part of V2. Sorry about that delay.
Alrighty, we've got a couple more here. So let's see. Does the .NET 5 product have a control that allows data to flow into a document similar to the way HTML flows with tags, etc., for WinForms?
So this sounds like this might be the closest thing we might have is the print document component that allows you to sort of just generate documents on the fly. Or if you want to generate HTML, we also have the C1 editor, which can display HTML content. Both of these controls, while they're not available at the moment for .NET 5, they are on the roadmap to be by the end of 2021. C1 editor is probably a V3 control. Print document is a V2.
Alrighty. Next one is, will date time range picker be available for filter bar in Blazor FlexGrid?
I cannot confirm if that's possible at the moment, but that is definitely a great idea for a sample or custom implementation. We'll take a look at that.
Alrighty. Next one is, are the FlexGrid enhancements of the autocomplete and multi-column sorting available for WinForms FlexGrid as well?
Yes, the multi-column sorting was available for WinForms, .NET Framework, and .NET 5.
Alrighty. For the moment, that's it. We might want to give it a couple minutes just in case because they are
Sure.
coming in. Oh, here's another one. Can we mix and match .NET 4 with .NET 5 controls?
It's not recommended because sometimes they might depend upon a base library. Like, for example, the C1.win library, you wouldn't be able to use both. The one downside to using .NET 4 controls in a .NET 5 app is that while it may technically be possible, your app still requires .NET Framework. So while it can be a temporary workaround, I would not stick with that for the long term. So while, let's say if you're working on .NET 5 now, but we don't have the component out yet, then you could certainly use the .NET 4 controls in .NET 5 temporarily, but long term you will want to replace it with .NET 5. And also there is no design time for .NET 4 controls in .NET 5. But if you're using .NET 5, there of course is design time. Right. Any other questions?
Does not seem to be any more yet. Not sure if we want to give it another minute just in case.
Yeah, we knew this webinar was only going to be 30 minutes, but we advertised it as an hour. Just because we're so used to making webinars an hour.
Yeah.
So I also want to thank everybody for attending, and we do plan to continue doing release webinars for ComponentOne for all future releases. So we're back to doing these. We had probably about a year or two where we had not done them. So we're back in action.
All right, we've got another one here.
Sure.
For the Blazor controls, will you support themes?
That's a good question. It's not on our immediate roadmap, but I could see that as something that we will look into probably next year.
Okay. And Michael just wants to say, not a question, but thank you for the presentation.
All right, thank you. Thanks, everyone. All right, so if we have no more questions, then we can wrap up for today. Again, thanks everyone for attending, and we'll see you at the next release.